All right. So we're now, as I said in the past, many people thought that, hello. In the past, many people thought that races were in some sense biological. So now we're going to look at in more detail at some of the arguments about if and to what extent that's true. Well, if it is true, how it's true, and so on. Or is it true? And we're discussing a couple of papers by the philosopher Keishorn Spencer. That's Keishorn Spencer, in a very smart suit with a nice tie. And these papers do a terrific job of surveying debates in philosophy about the reality of race. This book here is the one in which he, along with three other people, and we'll be reading more stuff by Sally Hassinger later, defend different accounts of race and defend different views about what races are. Now, Spencer begins with the obvious thought, which he cites in the work of Joshua Glasgow. There's Joshua Glasgow, and there's the book, Theory of Race. And this is a relatively influential work in the subject. Glasgow starts with something that might seem obvious, though as we'll see in a minute, not as obvious as it seems. That he says race is real just in case races exist. That's what it means to say the race is real. So the issue is a simple one. Asians, blacks, Native Americans, and whites are races. There are Asians, blacks, Native Americans, and whites, so races exist. So we could reason something like this. Races exist if and only if there are people who are members of those races. There are people who are members of the black race, so that race exists. So there's at least one race, the black race. That's this argument. But as Spencer argues, things are not really that simple. We need to get clear first about the metaphysical issues involved in existence. What conditions are sufficient for us to say that a race exists? The mere fact that we can use a noun correctly in an English sentence doesn't, in fact, guarantee that it does refer to something. I'll give you an example. This is an English noun. This sentence says that I gave up my lunch for Mary's sake. If you think that with the mere presence of a noun means that this sentence says that something exists, then there's presumably a sake of Mary's that I gave up my lunch for. Right? I gave up my lunch for Mary's brother. There's a brother of Mary's that I gave my lunch up for. So I gave up my lunch for Mary's sake. There's a sake of Mary's that I gave up my lunch for, right? But, of course, are there really sakes? Why is that wrong? I mean, well, I'll take a poll. Are there any sakes? No. Oh, sorry. Who thinks there are sakes? Who thinks there aren't sakes? Who's on the fence? Okay, because you're expecting me to be engaging in some kind of trickishness. But no, I think it's obvious once we think about what this means that it doesn't follow from the fact that this is so, that there are sakes. And that's because what this means is I gave up my lunch in order to do something for Mary. That's what it means to do something for somebody's sake. And now the sake has disappeared. Right? You don't need, if these are equivalent, and if this one doesn't imply the existence of sakes, then this one doesn't imply the existence of sakes, because they're equivalent, right? Now, there's a very famous example of arguing in this sort of way due to the great 20th century British philosopher Bertrand Russell, that shows that we don't really need to believe, for example, in the existence of the number one. Some people think the number one exists. They're called mathematical Platonists. Platonists believe that mathematical objects exist, sets, numbers and functions exist. But some don't. And so they're anti-realists about numbers, or nominalists about numbers. Well, what Russell did was the equivalent of what I just did with Sakes. He said, look, the number of Earth's moons is one. Earth has one moon. The number of Earth's moons is one. Might be thought to entail that there is an X such that X is the number of Earth's moons, right? And of course, the answer is, if one exists, then there is an X such that X is the number of Earth's moons, namely one. But what Russell showed was that this, or more colloquially, Earth has one moon, is equivalent to this. Consider anything at all. If that thing is a moon of the planet Earth, then consider any other thing. If that thing is a moon of the planet Earth, then those two things are the same thing. And that guarantees there's only one moon of Earth. Right? Is that obvious? There's a famous story about actually a man who was a friend of Lord Russell's, Bertrand Russell's, who was a great mathematician called Hardy. Hardy is supposed to have been giving lectures once on mathematics at the University of Cambridge, and he came in and he wrote on some complicated formula on the board. And he turned to the audience and said, gentlemen, that's obvious, right? And he looked a bit puzzled. He came back about 5 minutes later. He said, yes, it's obvious. Well, this is obvious if you think about it, I think. Like the Hardy's complicated formula. All right, so the specific region of metaphysics, ontology, that we need to operate in is the one, is ontology, which is the study of what there really is. Analyses like Russell's have been important to the modern history of ontology because they allow us to show that we don't need to refer to something, in this case, natural numbers. We don't need to think there are natural numbers in order to explain our use of the numerals. We can get rid of the numerals. You know, you just you can do this for 2 as well, and then you can do it for 3, and then you can set up a general method for replacing a natural number, a sentence containing a natural number, with a multiply quantified sentence like this. It's complicated to do. That's why in Principia Mathematica, which was a great early 20th century work of mathematics, philosophical logic, that Russell wrote with Whitehead, who was another philosopher, also a mathematician, of course. They didn't prove that 1 and 1 was 2 till about page 300. It's starting from very, very, very basic ideas. Showed that you could get rid of a lot of mathematical entities by just analyzing them out in ways like this. All right. And that, by the way, was associated with a project called Logicism, which was the attempt to show that there weren't any mathematical objects, that all truths of mathematics were just truths of logic. Logicism failed as a project. It's not obviously possible to reduce all true mathematical statements to choose the logic, but it's certainly possible to get rid of one, the numeral one. All right, so in other words, in order to decide whether the mere fact that we have the word race in sentences that we're inclined to assert actually means there really are races, we're going to do more than have to do more than just make the sort of simple argument that, well, we talk about African Americans are a race. Yeah, there are African Americans, so there are races. We need to go more carefully than that. So we need to do study some questions about the nature of these, what it is for something to exist. But the second thing Spencer says, so we need to do some metaphysics, Spencer says. The second thing he says we need to do is some linguistics, because he says we need to understand how people actually use the word race. It might turn out, for example, that reference to races was like reference to sakes. Once we understand what it really means, we'll see that talk about black people or Asian people or white people doesn't really commit us to the existence of races. It commits us to the existence of those people, but it doesn't commit us to the existence of the peoples, which in this perhaps sloppy way we say they belong to. Now, Spencer's claim that we might have to do some linguistics here, I think should strike us as a little odd. After all, what would a linguist do to find out how speaking people use the word race? They would ask some English people, some people who speak English. But we already speak English, so why do we need to ask anybody else? If we are reliable sources of information about how English words work, then why can't we just consult our own linguistic competence? Why do we need to engage expensive people to go around asking people questions when we can just sit in our study asking those questions of ourselves? So you might think that because I'm a competent speaker of English, someone who counts as understanding and using English correctly, all I have to do is just consult my own knowledge of the language in order to decide how the word is used. So here's a typical sentence expressing that thought from a book in the philosophy of language written in the 1980s. What does a theory of meaning tell us? Obviously, what sentences and other expressions mean. And what is that? Obviously, that is what people who know the language must know about the words and sentences and such. For someone who knows the language knows what these expressions mean. Knowing the language is just knowing what the words in the language mean. One kind of theory of meaning, then, will be an account of what people who know the language know. A theory of meaning is a statement of the implicit knowledge of speakers. But this slide will be up on the thing. You don't need to. Don't need to write it down. All right. That was me. I wrote that in 1985 in a book about assertion and conditional logic. And when I wrote that, nobody who was reading the book said, this is preposterous. So the theory ran, linguists and philosophers of language who look for meaning are investigating what competent speakers of the language know. What that means, by the way, just to go back to the metaphysics again, is that we don't really need meanings as entities. When we ask for meaning of a word in a language such as English, we're just asking, what is it you have to know in order to how to use that word? There doesn't need to be some extra other thing apart from whatever it is you have to know in order to know how to use the word correctly. And to get back to the linguistics point, if that's true, we English speakers don't need to do linguistics to answer Spencer's question. We need only to consult our own understanding. And that's why a lot of writing about these topics does consist of people in theorists, philosophers, saying what they think the word means and what are they consulting? Their knowledge of the language. Spencer cites the work of Larry Blum, author of this book, Another Racist But, who says, given what the word race means, which I know by introspection, the facts show that there aren't any races. Now, anti-Blum will say, given what the word race means, which I too know by introspection, those very same facts show that there aren't any, but that there are races. Right? So how are they to settle their dispute? There are people in this domain who think that, who've argued that given the proper understanding of the word race, there are races. There are people who think, so how are they supposed to settle their dispute? Okay. Well, we'll get back to the minute, but I want to introduce a complication here that I think will be useful, which is a complication to the account of what it is to be a competent speaker of a language that will help in thinking about this question. So I'm going to introduce some terminology, and as usual, when I do that, I'm just saying how I'm going to plan to use those words. I'm not offering a definition of any of these words. I'm just telling you how I'm going to use them in these conversations. So I'm going to say that the way that each competent English speaker uses a word like race or electron or maybe even cat is guided by a specific conception, that person has a conception that determines how that person uses the word. And you're a competent speaker of the language only if your conception, your conception is consistent with the norms governing what I'm going to call the concept of race. The concept of race is a specification of how you use the word. Sorry, the concept is a specification of the constraints on how you use the word, such that if your usage violates those constraints, your linguistic community will count you as not understanding the word at all. Right? Now, very interesting, complicated questions here about how linguistic communities are constituted and how, as it were, who has authority to say what. I'm going to prescind from those questions. We can have a whole course on those questions, but that's let me just point out that as an issue, because I think it's clear, whatever you say about those questions, that there are things you can do with your race language that will lead the other speakers of English, or this dialect of English we speak in North America, to say she doesn't know what race means. And so in that case, fixing the concept of race is identifying the norms that determine whether your conception should be accepted in your community as being consistent with the terms, as we say, meaning. If people in your community, in discussions about your usage, conclude that your conception doesn't fit within the community's linguistic norms, then it doesn't count as a conception of race. It's a misconception of race. So people can have different conceptions of something, but all of them must fit within the norms set by the concept. All right? And I think that's true of a very wide range of conception. Oh, yes?
Just understand the constraints of C. What is that supposed to mean? How is that related to
sorry, C is just the constraints on proper use of the word X. And so you have a conception such that there's a way of using the word, but it has to be consistent with whatever the constraints are set by the concept. Is that?
So we can set the concept and the conception.
We collectively, speakers of a particular dialect, are going to set the concept, as we're going to decide what ways of using the word count as permissible given the word's meaning in our community. And then, but it'll turn out that each particular person, or it could turn out that each particular person has a particular way of thinking about what races are. That's a little bit different from what other people's are, but it counts as a conception of race because it fits within the general constraints on how the word race should be used. But we can, there are rules in basketball governing whether something is a pass, whether you succeed in transferring the ball to somebody else in a way that's consistent with the rules. But there are lots of different passing games. There are lots of different ways of passing. There's not very wrong in the game, but it's permissible. Counts as a pass if you manage to get the ball that way, right? But there'll be some people who always pass one way or another. Though I wouldn't recommend that because you have to identify that. You have to set the passes. But okay. So a community set rules. A community can define ways of doing something such that as long as you do something within the way set by those rules, it counts as passing, it counts as using the word race for it. Ready? Yeah.
Yeah, what I was gonna see was that, so basically everyone can have their own phone. Or speak.
Yes, as long as rule usage fits within whatever the constraints are,
What if it goes?
then you're misusing the word. Which is fine. I mean, I misuse words all the time sometimes as well. But I know usually what I'm doing is, and it's meant as a provocation, and other competent speakers of the language will say, okay, whatever he means by that, he's not using the word properly. Okay. I think we've already seen some evidence that this is true of the concept of race, because when I asked you questions, I've asked you questions about races over the last 6 lectures. Some of you have said yes, some of you have said no, some of you said I don't know. That suggests that there isn't a very determinate structure to the concept. But some of you have very determinate conceptions. Some of you think it's obvious that, I think some of you thought it was obvious that my nephew was white, for example. Maybe all of you thought that, I don't know. Despite having 100% African grandfather, which, as I say, would not have been so in the time of Walter White, whom I showed you on the cover of Time magazine, because he was, as we say, a very light-skinned African American, or light complected, we sometimes say, having a light complexion. And so that just means that, according to some conceptions of the African American racial group, having one African ancestor makes you black, and according to some others, it doesn't. Okay. Now, you can't, for there to be a concept at all, there have to be some constraints. You can't use the word race any old way you like. Otherwise, it can't do any work in our language. And so one of the norms, I think, that's associated with these kind of concepts that refer to things is that the term must pick out certain standard cases and exclude certain standard counterexamples. So, on the one hand, if the conception that guides your use of the word race means that African Americans and Asians aren't races, it doesn't fit with our concept of race. I mean, either there aren't races or there aren't Asian Americans. I mean, there isn't a race of Asian Americans, right? I mean, or there is a race of Asian Americans, and then there are races. And now, there's no doubt been shifts here. I'll prove that because this is a passage from Charles Dickens's novel, Our Mutual Friend, published in the 19th century. And in Our Mutual Friend, Mr. Boffin asks the secretary in his legal office, was he prejudiced against the race of lawyers? And reviewers of this book did not say, what on earth does Dickens mean by using the word race? Because at best, if someone were to speak this way today, we would take them to be speaking metaphorically about races. Now, people use terms metaphorically and therefore in some sense incorrectly all the time. And we try to figure out metaphorical uses. And that is another fascinating topic in the philosophy of language and in linguistics. How do people interpret metaphors? Because metaphors are typically not literally true. Right? Juliet is not the sun. Behold, what light from yonder window breaks. It is the east, and Juliet is the sun, Romeo says. Well, she isn't the sun. She's a 14-year-old girl. But we understand, sort of, what he's saying. Right? When she appears to him, he feels the way he feels when the sun rises in the morning. He feels lifted up, but not literally lifted up. Right? Little understood what I meant. So a lot of understanding of language is like that. What I said is not literally correct, and it's a fascinating fact about language that people can use language in non-literal ways. Arguably, almost everything most people say is in fact not literally true. Even the word literally is most often used metaphorically. Right? You say, he literally told me. Well, he didn't literally tell you. If he literally told you, he would have said those very words, but he didn't say those very words. He said something else. All right. This is just to say that we're working here with a kind of idealized picture of the language in which we can identify some things as just straightforwardly correct usages and some things as straightforwardly incorrect usages. And then there's a lot of intermediate cases. As I say, it seems to me that this usage, which was common in the 19th century English and going way back to, I already quoted 17th century English, right, where Sarabas says, let's say the race that I descended of was all in general cast away for sin, shall I be tried by their transgression? There again, since race has this much wider usage at that time, we can only suppose that he means a group of people. That it's not got the tight sense of a biological race that we came to have later. Or when Miranda of the Tempest says about Caliban, first him as being of that vile race. Well, Caliban, as I pointed out in the reading, doesn't belong to any human race. Because when Miranda says he's a demi-devil, she means literally that his father was a devil and his mother was a witch, Sycorax. There's no race because there's no human race that anyone's ever believed in that's composed of the children of devils and witches. But so whatever they meant by race, I think we have to conclude and those are there aren't a lot of uses of this word in Elizabethan English drama, but those are two of them, and neither of which means what this means now. So race here in the Dickens just means a kind or a group of people. Now, because this notion of a concept has to do with what's going to be accepted in a community of speakers, it is in a certain sense a political notion. Because what is accepted in communities is shaped by who has social status, who has authority, who has literal power. In France, for example, there is a legal system for deciding what a word means. It means roughly what the Académie Française says it means, which is a body created by Cardinal Richelieu in the 16th, well, actually in the early 17th century. In 1634, it was created to maintain literary standards. Cardinal Richelieu was the chief minister of Louis XIII. I don't know if any of you have ever seen, have read The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas, or perhaps seen a movie of the Three Musketeers. Well, that's Richelieu is the Prime Minister in France during the period of the Three Musketeers. He created for the king a body whose dictionary is the definitive dictionary of French. The word is French if and only if it's in the French dictionary government says. When I was in prep school, I remember one day the French teacher came in and told us that a new word had been added to the French language. He said to us, gentlemen, we were 8 and 9, but he called us gentlemen. A sad thing has happened today. The Académie Française has admitted the word bulldozer into the French language. So the correct way to refer to a bulldozer in French is bulldozer. And at a certain point later, they admitted the word weekend into the French language. So the weekend in France is just called le weekend. All right. So, but that's power. This guy was the top guy. He could execute people. Oh, well, not literally. He could order people executed. I suppose if he wanted to execute people, he might even have been allowed to do it himself, but he didn't want to. So American English, especially in its written form, is shaped by rules enforced by teachers in schools, as well as by parents at home. When you're learning to write at home or in school, if you spell a word in a way that the dictionary doesn't admit, your teacher will correct it. And if you pronounce a word in a way, as you're learning the language, when a new word is introduced to you, you will be introduced to a way of pronouncing it, and your teacher will correct that. Perhaps especially vigorously if it's an ESL class, the teacher will say, no, it's not how we say it. So, for example, if you say enormity, whose primary meaning that word is a great evil, when you mean enormousness, that is the property of being very large, teachers used to correct people, and then the American Heritage Dictionary gave up on that one, and so now it allows you to use it in both these senses. But there used to be two distinct words, enormity and enormousness, and they meant two distinct things. Now they've gotten all muddled up. Now there can be reason for thinking that promoting one conception or another, or insisting, in other words, on enforcing a constraint, a norm for a concept, will make a difference to how things go in society. Some people think that's true. That's why some people think we shouldn't talk in certain ways, because they think that that'll make a difference to how things go. So some people think that we'll be more respectful of trans people if we use the pronouns that they want. And so that's why some of us ask people what pronouns they have. We think it'll make a difference, not just to linguistic things, but to non-linguistic. And that's obviously true in particular. There will be power effects of using, accepting or using words, certain political words, in certain ways. People have different conceptions of democracy, right? So you can't count the government in North Korea. If you think that the government of North Korea is democracy, you don't know what the word means. But if you are doubtful about whether the United States will be a democracy next year, well, that's an open question, perhaps. It doesn't follow from the fact that you think that's an open question that you don't understand the word democracy. But it does mean you have a specific conception of democracy. So I think if your conception of democracy includes Mr. Comrade Stalin's Russia, then you don't know, I think, what a democracy is. If you think Cambodia under Pol Pot was a democracy, I think you don't know what a democracy is. If you think France under Richelieu was a democracy, I think you don't know what a democracy is. So philosophical theories of democracy are often, among other things, attempts to argue for a particular conception of democracy, understanding that there's a more general concept which is being debated about, and that when a philosopher argues for a particular conception of democracy, she is not saying, this is what the word really means, this is what should be in the dictionary. She's intending to use the word in a way that's consistent with the dictionary usage, so that which is this broad set of constraints on conceptions, but she's arguing for a particular conception, and usually because she thinks that that thinking of things that way will lead us to organize society in a way that's better. All right. So let's just think for a minute about two or three of examples. Race and democracy are hereby excluded from consideration, where there are different conceptions in play, obviously different conceptions in play in contemporary American English or New York English, whatever you want, whatever local dialect you want to do. Yes. Good. So, if you thought that gender had nothing at all to do with the sexual body, we would just have to correct it. But there are lots of different ways of thinking about the relationship between sexual body and gender identities. And there are reasons, as I said, for preferring some to others, no doubt. But they're not, these are not disagreements about the meaning of a word, they're disagreements about how to think about it. Concepts of really evolved. Okay, so did everybody hear that? Good, evil, and truth. Good. All right. So certainly one way in which it's true that there are different conceptions of, say, good is that there are what Rawls, the philosopher John Rawls, called different conceptions of the good life. There are different ways of thinking about what it is for a human being's life to go well. This is a central question of ethics. Provided something's a serious candidate for a view about how human lives can go well, it's a view about the good. But if it's about something else, then it's not. So there are constraints on something, on the conception of good. I think there are absolutely different conceptions of truth. Theories, philosophers have theories of truth, different accounts of truth, what it is. Yes.
I think the concept of life has very different conceptions with the
Yes. Well, also now with AI. I mean, are they, you know, at what point is some artificial intelligence system going to count as being, if ever, are we going to say that it's alive? And my guess is that because people think differently about this question, there will be serious disagreements about this, and it will be silly to think of them as disagreements about just a word, as long as the candidate view is a view that counts you as alive and Mussolini as dead, not alive, right? Yes.
The word slay, like in English.
Slave?
Slay.
Slay. Oh, okay.
Specifically with contemporary English.
Good.
Would that be part of it?
Okay, so there's two different things here, right? Some words have more than one meaning. Bank, right? Riverbank, financial bank. Just happens that we use the same words to refer to two different things. There may be a historical reason. I don't know what it is. There is one, but it's from a linguist point of view, those are two different words which just sound the same or spelled the same, right? There's another way of thinking about it where they're the same word, but so with slay, one meaning covers a whole range of things to do with making to be unalive. And there's another that has to do with whatever Gothic way you know, I don't use the word this way, so I don't have much grip on exactly how it's to be used. But so how would you explain the other slay?
Doing something well, maybe.
Okay, right. So
But is that
acing.
official definition? Is there an official
Um,
definition of that slay?
well, if you look in the online Encyclopedia of American Slang, I bet you can find that uses, yes. But look, they think they're just reporting a usage, right? They're not trying to make it true that slay means anything. They're just saying there seem to be people out there who use it like this. And if there's enough of them, then that is one of the things the word means in the dialects of those people. There's nothing more to, and nothing less to it's being the case that a word means something in a community, that's how people use it. And other people in the community recognize the distinction between using it properly and using it not properly. Yes.
Would the word harm be?
Good. I mean, harm is a very contested word.
Right, especially like I know that John Stuart Mill's like his harm principle, like what is harm?
Yes.
Like if you're using it as a like prerequisite to take away somebody's rights, and like you have to have a clear definition, but
Yeah.
everybody has a different conception of it.
Good. Yes. So again, if I were to take out my poignard and stab in the arm, my dagger, anybody who thought that what did count as harming you would be just not competent speaker of English. But if I were to insult you in some way, there might be reasonable disagreements about not about whether it was wrong. It's wrong to insult people, but about whether it was harmful, right? Notice that it's a complicated question, because if the knife that I use to slice into your arm is a scalpel and I'm your surgeon and I'm removing a skin cancer, that's the opposite of harming you. So you need to know a lot about if someone, in other words, saw me doing that to you, removing a skin cancer, and said you're harming her, that could be just because they misunderstand what's happened. It's not that might not be a semantical error. If I said to them, no, I'm a doctor, that thing needs to come out because otherwise it'll spread. Then they would say, oh, I'm sorry, that's not a harm. Right? So, yes.
Would ward count as like?
Perfect. Now, so there are legal definitions of warfare, right? So under our Constitution, under the American Constitution, there is no war unless the Congress declares one.
But we still like do judge fights.
But we haven't had a declared war in a very long time, and there's something in the history books called the Vietnam War, and there was never a declaration of war. Right. So now I think it's perfectly reasonable to call it war and say that maybe the courts should have said this is a war. What the courts actually do in those cases is usually to say this is not our job. The fight between the president and the House, the Congress, they have to duke it out. We don't deal with consents. But you may or may not think that's not very a wise thing for the court to have decided to do. Not to intrude in social place, but that's so there's a notion of warfare such that it doesn't matter what the lawyers, right? The fact that the lawyers say, well, there's not technically a war here, doesn't mean that you aren't standing on opposite sides of the line shooting at each other.
I also feel like war could be like the idea of like a financial security, political.
Good. So the acts of war, right, can include obviously, firing a cannon into the wall of your city is an act of war. Again, with the appropriate background, maybe it's just helping you to get rid of another wall so build a new one. Okay, so that's not an act of war. But if a foreign power, is sending a cannonball through your wall, then that's an act of war. But is it an act of war when you the international lawyers think it's an act of war if you barricade the seaports in the foreign country, stop things coming out of the country. That isn't shooting anything, it isn't using a weapon, but it's regarded as an act of war. It certainly is a very hostile act, where, of course, that comes from the hostile. So that's a word for good. So now, if once you think about it, an awful lot of words like this. That is, they're contested as to exactly how to understand them. And one of the ways we discuss how we want to behave is to talk about what we want to call things. Because we may agree, for example, that other things being equal, being more democratic is better than being less democratic. But it can be complicated to decide whether a change in the laws or practices increases or diminishes democracy. It can be unclear. And some things will be more democratic under some conceptions and less democratic under others. Depends what your conception of democracy is. And it's not unreasonable, as I said, that people have these different conceptions. That's how things are. Good. All right. So you mentioned gender. I'd say, and we'll see this later on, equality is another one. Even more contentious these days, equity, but perhaps that's not a word in ordinary circulation, but there's a lot of dispute about what's more equitable, and so on. All right. So Spencer recall that said we needed to do two things to settle these racial realist questions, some metaphysics and some linguistics. I've just been talking through the complexity of what those claims actually are going to amount to. As you notice, one thing he does is tell us some more biology. And remember from the discussion last time that there's a way in which that is what you'd expect, because if we're practicing semantic deference, if we have a bunch of ideas about what races are roughly like, and we're looking for the X that is like that, then maybe the biologists are the people who know. Right, that's a way of getting to where Spencer wants to go. Now, Spencer is a good role model here because he's a philosopher of biology, but he has a Master of Science in biology as well as a PhD in philosophy, so he's learned the relevant science in order to write his dissertation, which was about whether cladistic race is a genuine kind. That's we'll talk about clades later, but one of the big questions in biology is what are the real kinds of organisms? Are reptiles really a real kind of organism? Are hominids a real kind of, are primates a real kind of organism? And why? And so, anyway, Spencer would be able to discuss that with us because he has a deep knowledge of current work in the biology of classification, which I'll just call systematics, which is connected with evolutionary biology, because the central thought of modern biology in the title of Darwin's book, Origin of Species, is that biological kinds are the result of evolution by natural selection. A species is a kind, and Darwin had a theory about how biological kinds came to exist. And so he's well able to explain to us what these technical terms in systematics mean. Now, the central idea of the biologist's concept of a subspecies is that it's a group of organisms, a subgroup of an existing species, in a way that is on its way to becoming a distinct species. Remember how Darwin's theory combined with modern Mendelian genetics works. That is, you have a population of sexually reproducing organisms that are of a single species. So the typical male fertile member of the species is capable of producing offspring with any of the typical fertile females. The genes of all these potentially reproducing organisms are the gene pool of the population. They're all the genes available for reproduction. Over time, genetic mutations occur in particular organisms, and these give rise to subpopulations which carry a new allele, a new variant of a gene that has some new effect on the phenotype, on the appearance of the organism, which means that now the gene pool has been expanded. There's a new gene that wasn't there before. And the point, Darwin's point is, in a particular environment, the new phenotype may be better adapted, meaning that organisms bearing that gene will survive in larger numbers on average than those not bearing that gene at that locus, at that site on the genome. And as a result, the gene will increase in frequency in the population over time. Right? Now, suppose you all have very diverse intellectual backgrounds, so feel free to stop me if any of this is unfamiliar. There's no reason why I don't assume that everybody knows all this already. So I'm speaking as if I'm reminding you, but if any of this is unfamiliar, please say, and we can make sure that we understand these background ideas. So the frequency with which individuals in that population reproduce with members of the wider population, that subpopulation, can, if you get a subpopulation, can gradually decline so that eventually there's no, as we say, gene flow. There's no genes flowing between the two populations because there's no reproduction occurring between members of this population and members of that population. The obvious sort of way in which this can happen with an organism is an earthquake occurs, a new river is in place, the animals can't swim, so the ones who happen to be on one side are no longer able to reproduce with the ones who have to be on the other side. Right? Now, at the beginning of this process, those two are just random samples of the whole population. But if different mutations occur over time in the different populations, then the gene pools will start to differ. I mean, they may differ anyway, because it may be that the earthquake that created the river occurred early in the morning, and the ones that members of the population that got up earlier were foraging in the new place, and so there's a genetic difference because early foraging is associated with a genetic difference, something like that, right? But there's no reason why that should be. Maybe it's be a random. We don't think about the creation of subpopulations in the human population. All our earliest hominid ancestors were in Africa. Then some left, maybe 100,000 years ago, say, and maybe they were just a random sampling. But maybe they were ones that carried a gene that made it more likely that you would explore. We don't know. Right? We can look and see. All right. So one way in which subpopulations can be generated is just by migration. Once human beings move out of Africa, and within 10,000 years, there are human beings in the Pacific. Which is not a very long time, think about it. They have aeroplanes. That population, of course, is no longer able to reproduce with the population over here because it takes 10,000. In order to mate, you have to meet. If you're too far apart, you can't meet. And if there are then mountains between you or whatever, the rate of gene flow can fall very low, perhaps to zero. Now, when populations are separated by something like a river or an earthquake, two organisms that are quite alike in their genomes, in their intrinsic biological properties, can come to belong to different populations because they're no longer available for reproduction to each other. And two organisms that are quite dissimilar, on the other hand, can belong to the same population, right? The shortest person in New York City, the shortest male heterosexual New York City is potentially a partner of the tallest female heterosexual person in New York City. Well, actually, it doesn't, you don't have to be heterosexual. Reproduction doesn't require desire. So there can be huge variations within a population, and then on the other hand, two distinct populations which can't interbreed can be quite alike. There's a nice example of this. Philosopher Philip Kitcher pointed out there's a species of lizard, I wish I could remember its name off the top of my head, but it's mentioned in the reading somewhere, in the Caribbean, and there's two subspecies. One lives up trees and one lives at the bottom of trees. because of their behavioral difference, and I think they maybe have different times of day when they're active. And as a result, they're not much different from each other. They don't look very different, but there's almost no gene flow between these two because they're behaviorally, reproductively isolated. All right. Consider a population split in two by that earthquake and the sudden appearance of a new river. Consider A, B, and C, members of the original population before the split. Suppose these two are close kin, maybe cousins or something, and suppose A and B have no recent ancestry in common, right? It's still the case that now this is a separate population from that one, even though A and C are much more alike than A and B. C is no longer in the population because they're now reproductively isolated. And barriers to reproduction don't have to be physical, like rivers, or spatial. But those lizards, there's a behavioral difference between the two populations that keeps them reproductively isolated. And that might be the difference between the times of day in which you're active. Most large vertebrates sleep, but some sleep earlier than others. And some, like bears, sleep an awful lot in the winter. And bears are basically reproductively unavailable to each other when they're hibernating, obviously. All right, so when any of these things happens, we say that the two subpopulations are now reproductively isolated. That is to say, there's no gene flow between them, where gene flow between them just means members of this population don't mate with members of that population. So once that happens, two consequences will occur. One is that mutations in one subpopulation won't be transferred into the gene pool of the other. They may reoccur, though that's very unlikely because the likelihood of a particular mutation is quite small, and mutations on the Darwinian theory are supposed to be caused by sort of random processes like cosmic radiation hitting DNA and knocking out a base pair or something. If these new variants are produced at random, then there'll be differences produced at random in the frequency of genes in the two gene pools, not because of selection, right? Just because of the random occurrence of mutations. That's sometimes called genetic drift. But if these two populations are in different environments, then they can be subjected to different selection pressures, which is to say that what is adaptive in one environment may not be adaptive in another. We'll come back to this example later, but no, I won't use that example. Let me use another, example I'm not going to use now, I will come back to later. Warm-blooded animals lose heat through their extremities for reasons that have to do with the fact that heat loss is a function of the ratio of surface area to volume, and periphery, there's more surface area per unit of volume. Here, this is a lot of surface area, but there's a huge unit of volume behind it. So, all right. So that means that if you're a warm-blooded animal, you lose heat through your toes. So, and thermal balance is one of the things that makes warm-blooded animals work. Human beings, for example, have remarkable capacity to maintain our body temperature even in quite diverse environments in a pretty narrow band, other things being equal. But that, and so you'll lose more heat, and maybe you'll also get frostbite and things in cold climate. Those of us who've been living through the last couple of weeks have been keeping our fingers close, not just because we don't like to lose heat, but because we don't want to lose our fingers. So as a general rule, the colder the environment, the less it's okay to have these dangly extremities. And so in colder climates, populations of many mammals have genetic mutations that make the toes shorter and fatter, and the fingers. The foretoes and the rear toes in these animals. As a general rule, then, among mammals, tropical species tend to have longer toes than those in the far north or south of the planet. So now we can have two subpopulations with increasingly different genes and frequencies of genes in their gene pools. Now, because it's better to have some alleles than others, better because if you have those genes and alleles, you are more likely to produce offspring. And as Darwin saw, evolution is basically a matter of genes out competing each other in survival rates. Now, over a very long time, one thing that can happen as a result of these selection pressures is that it comes about that those members of the two populations can't reproduce anymore and produce fertile offspring. Obviously, the simplest example of this is just going to be if it's better to be smaller in one environment and bigger than another, then eventually it's going to be the case that you can't reproduce if you're a vertebrate, because if you try to grow a hybrid female who's very small, she'll die because the fetus will get too big to be held in her body, right? So that's one way it can happen. Another way it can happen is just there's some variants of Drosophila, which I mentioned as a species that's been much studied for evolutionary genetic purposes, that can't reproduce because they have because of the way their genitalia are shaped, so they're going to reproduce with organisms of the same. They're all Drosophila, but some of them can't reproduce with others because they have a wrong combination of kinds of sexual organs. All right. So Darwin's central thought is that as populations separate, as they get subjected to selection pressures and also randomly accumulate different mutations, they may eventually become so different from one another that reproduction, that if you brought them back together, they couldn't reproduce them. Right? And then you've got a species, because Darwin thought of species as basically the groups within which gene flow occurs. Well, he didn't think of it that way because he didn't know about genes, but he thought about reproductive. He basically thought that if two organisms could reproduce, then the two species, the two kinds they belong to, were not distinct species. Sorry, if they could reproduce and then offspring could reproduce as well. So horses and donkeys can reproduce, that produces mules, but mules can't reproduce. That's why horses and donkeys are not one species, even though they can reproduce with one another, because they can't produce fertile offspring. So every mating of a donkey and a horse is a reproductive dead end, is a genetic dead end. All right. So at the beginning of the process, we have a population. They spread, say, there's some isolation mechanism, some different selection pressures and different mutations, and eventually they're so different that they can't reproduce with one another. But on the way from the one population to the two, there's a period in the middle, right, where they're still members of the same species, because in principle, if you bring them together, they can reproduce, but they're developing in the sort of direction that if it goes on like that, they'll end up a separate species. So subspecies are kind of subpopulations that are on their way. It's a hypothesis that in the future they might become separate species because they're no longer exchanging genes, and eventually they may not be able to exchange genes any longer. All right, all that clear. Now, one technical way to implement this idea is due to the great evolutionary biologist, theorist Ernst Mayr. He defined a subspecies, as Spencer reports, as an aggregate collection of phenotypically similar local populations of a species inhabiting a geographic subdivision of the range of that species, differing taxonomically from other populations of the species. So to understand this, we need to get clear about some of these key terms. We already know what phenotypically similar means, right? This means they look the same, or they have their overt characteristics of the same. So this is, and in sometimes when biologists are talking about phenotypes, they're using it in a rather extended sense to mean just say what proteins are in the thing, which is not really a feature of how you appear, but it is a manifestation of your genome that's distinct from the genome itself. But often phenotypically just means, you know, what it means when we're talking about humans. Two members of subspecies sort of look alike. Look alike, not just to the naked eye, but to maybe to the microscopic eye when you look at the tissues and so on. All right. What's a population? It's a group of organisms mating at random. Now, we say mating at random, of course, never happens. If you think about it, individual organisms, well, it happens in small populations of, well, I'm going to do that, but because I'm talking about sexually reproducing species because we're a sexually reproducing species and it's our classification that we're interested in. There are lots of most of the biomass of the Earth is in non-sexually reproducing species. It's in tiny things, bacteria, viruses, and various other things that are hard to classify as either of those things, algae and so on. And those are not necessarily sexually reproducing, and so there, all this discussion has to be different for how to classify them, because the question of reproductive isolation doesn't occur if you aren't reproducing. All right. So, mating at random isn't going to happen really. Individual organisms may have habits that keep them, like being further up in the tree, from meeting others, so they don't mate at random. But the thought is that there's a population, and within that population, gene flow is occurring. Maybe it's occurring in such a way that it's not that the females here and the males here are have a propensity to reproduce with one another. It's that the males here have a propensity to reproduce with these females have a propensity with males, those males have a female, and eventually genes can flow across that space over a series of matings, not just one. So you can think of these genes as traveling in the sense that each moment of reproduction produces an organism that's in a particular place, and if there's a tendency for a certain gene to increase in frequency over here, then you could think of genes flowing that way, and that could be for lots of reasons, of course. All right, the basic idea then is that some parts of the total population of a species will consist of organisms in a geographical area, geographic subdivision of the range. The range of a species is just the whole geography within which it lives. So the crows, the Eurasian crows range is from Ireland to Japan. But there are subdivisions within that range. And in those subdivisions, there'll be much higher rates of feeding flow within that than there will be across the whole range. So you can say that organisms have a tendency to mate with members of their local population. That's just because of what reproduction is. It involves contact. And you're more likely to contact someone if you're closer to them than if you're further away. Again, range, as I said, means the geographical area in which the species tends to live. That can include areas where the species is currently not present, because you've ever had the privilege of watching, say, one of the great migrations on the Serengeti in East Africa. Sometimes certain antelopes are one part of the range, and there's none in this part of the range, and then they move back, and then they're in that, and then the range is the whole thing. It's not where they are now; it's the whole geographical area within which they move. Now, as I say, these technical terms in biology often refer to tendencies. So a local population is defined by tendencies to mate, and the range is defined by tendencies to live. And those notions are obviously intrinsically a little bit vague. It doesn't mean we can't make good scientific use of them, otherwise systematics wouldn't be a field. But it just shows that there can be fields in which there are terms, useful scientific terms, that are nevertheless vague. But the most important and challenging idea is the idea of taxonomic difference. Taxonomy is the theory of classification. So at any time, there will be views in systematics about what the important properties of organisms are for the purposes of classification. For mare, populations A and B are taxonomically distinct if there's a statistically significant difference in their gene pools embedded in the distribution of alleles in the two populations. So a subspecies is just now glossing all this, it's a collection of organisms that tend to reproduce with one another, that occupies some part of the geographical area that the organisms of that kind tend to occupy, that has a significantly different statistical distribution of genes from other groups of the same organism that tend to reproduce with one another.
Are those kind of biological question will be shown in the exam as well?
Well, you would be able to draw on this knowledge if you want to answer a question in the exam that has to do with biological ideas about race, but you won't have to probably, because, as I said, I put up an example of an exam as an announcement today. It's not an exam for this course, but it shows you the structure of the exam, and you'll see that you'll have to answer a couple of questions from a lot of questions, both in the short answers, which are just making sure you know what certain words mean, and in the slightly longer answers where you grasp some arguments about something. So, okay. I'll put the PowerPoint for this lecture and the next are together, but I'll put them both up now, since you might want to look at this stuff and ask questions about it next time.
Like right now, after that, getting dinner with my friend at Steve at my restaurant. Oh, really?